My guest at this time is Luke Coffey. He's director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation in Washington. We've asked him to talk about the latest developments in the United Kingdom, and it's been a very busy week full of big developments, from suspending Parliament to losing a working majority for the new Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson to being denied new elections. So a lot to unpack and figure out where we're headed from here and how all this affects the Brexit question. So, Luke, first of all, thanks very much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And you're absolutely right. There's no shortage of items to talk about when it comes to British politics these days.
No, not at all. So let's start with where I think this narrative of the past several days started, and that was the Queen, Elizabeth II, giving Boris Johnson permission to suspend Parliament. Why did he want to do that, and how does it relate to what he wants to get done, which is get out of the EU by the end of October?
Well, this is actually a completely normal thing that usually happens once a year. Whenever there's a new session of Parliament, the Prime Minister will ask the Queen to, it's called prorogation, but that's the fancy word. All of us, we use the word suspend Parliament for a certain amount of time to reset the clock. And then what happens is there's a new opening of Parliament, and the Queen comes and delivers a speech, and the speech is actually written by the Prime Minister outlining his or her agenda for the coming year. But the problem is there hasn't been one of these resets, one of these suspensions in almost 3 years. And this is actually the longest stretch without having one since the 1600s. So Boris Johnson, being the new prime minister, wanting to focus on more things than just Brexit, education, law enforcement, security, the economy, he wanted to have the Queen start a new session of Parliament. Now, the reason why this is controversial is because his opponents claim that this is a delaying tactic so he could force through the UK leaving the European Union without having a deal with the EU. So just leaving without any sort of prearranged agreement with the European Union. But Boris Johnson has repeatedly pointed out, and including some documents that were shown to a court recently, that this actually had been planned for a while, this idea of suspending Parliament. And also, I must point out that it's been in the media, it's been spun like he has been suspending Parliament for several weeks. But in reality, Parliament was out of session anyway and was supposed to go back on October 7th. And instead of going back on October 7th, they're coming back on October 14th. So it's not quite as drastic as some in the press are making it out to be.
So one of the things that we know from the Theresa May era as prime minister is that she tried to push a deal through Parliament to have a deal in place for Brexit several times. In fact, that's why she's not prime minister anymore, is because she never succeeded in that sense. So given the failure to pass any sort of deal through Parliament, why is this move considered so controversial?
Well, Boris Johnson is committed to Brexit. He was one of the leading campaigners for Brexit. Remember, Theresa May did not support Brexit during the referendum campaign. So he has a certain amount of ownership on the whole Brexit issue that Theresa May never had. And he's very clear that he wants the UK to leave the European Union, and he's very clear it's going to be by October 31st. Now, I'm not quite sure how that's going to happen, considering current circumstances. The Parliament has made it very difficult for the UK to leave by October 31st, but Boris Johnson is determined to do so even by that date. And in fact, he even said yesterday that he would rather die in a ditch, and that's quoting him, he'd rather die in a ditch than go to Brussels to ask for an extension. He thinks an extension to remain in the EU to try to get a deal is pointless. They're not negotiating in good faith. The British people overwhelmingly voted to leave the EU, and it's been almost 3.5 years later. And he wants to be the prime minister that finally delivers on this promise. And he does have wide popular support among the public to do this, but he has been denied the opportunity to have a general election.
So let's get to that in just a moment. So what exactly did the Parliament decide, and I believe it was both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, about what was okay in terms of leaving Brexit? I believe they both ruled against a no-deal Brexit. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Well, the House of Commons, basically what happened was when Boris Johnson lost his working majority, there was this opportunity for a group of members of parliament to come together around a single issue and vote together on a single issue. And this single issue was passing a law that states that the UK cannot leave the European Union unless it has a deal. So this is the current state right now. Right now there is a law that says the UK has to, if the UK leaves by October 31st, it has to do so having agreed a deal with Brussels, and also a deal has to be approved by Parliament. The House of Lords didn't really have much to do with this. Yes, they were debating this issue, but Boris Johnson, and in fact, some of the strong Brexit supporters in the House of Lords had developed this filibuster strategy that they were going to try to run out the clock so this bill could never be passed. But Boris Johnson, knowing that there will have to be an election in the coming weeks, told the House of Lords not to fight this battle. He wants this battle fought in the House of Commons, and he wants to be able to go to the public and say, look, it was your House of Commons that you vote for, because remember, the Lords aren't elected, they're appointed. Boris Johnson can go back and say, your House of Commons that you vote for let you down. They failed to get us out of the European Union by October 31st. So he wants this battle to be, he wants this election campaign to be between the people of Britain and Parliament. And right now he's teeing it up quite nicely to do so. It's just he hasn't the ability right now to have an election.
Well, that's where I was going next, because Parliament's rejected the call for a new election. So how does this stalemate get broken?
Yeah, well, it's an unbelievable, almost extraordinary situation where you have the opposition party for 2 years, almost daily, calling for a new election. And then they're given an opportunity to do so, and they vote against it. In the past, the Prime Minister used to be able to call for an election any time he or she wanted to. That was one of the curiosities of British parliamentary democracy. When the Prime Minister wanted an election, they called for it, and about 5 or 6 weeks later, there was one. Completely different from our system here in the U.S. But in 2010, because of certain political circumstances, Parliament passed a piece of legislation called the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which required 2/3 of members of Parliament to agree to a general election. 2/3. And right now, the Labour Party, who's in the opposition, they are scared of a general election because they know that the momentum is against them. Polling shows that people want this Brexit question to be over one way or the other. Even those who aren't supportive of the idea of leaving the European Union want some sort of resolution to this. And Boris Johnson knows that if he can go to the public, if he can go to the people, he can secure a large enough mandate that he can then start the process of actually pulling the UK out of the European Union.
Two follow-ups on this, Luke. First of all, why the huge divide? Why is the public in the position where, regardless of where they were 3 years ago when this issue was headed towards a referendum, looking to just resolve it? And if Boris Johnson wants to do it this way, yeah, fine, go ahead and do it that way. But Parliament is not. Why the huge divide here?
Well, I think you can draw this down to similar political divides that you see across most of Europe and in the United States, where there seems to be this divide between the average person on the street and the political elites. And the British people made it very clear on June 23rd, 2016, that they want to leave the European Union. It wasn't a piece of advice to the government. It was an instruction to the government. And we shouldn't forget that the 17.4 million people that voted for Brexit, that was the largest single mandate ever given on anything by the British public ever. So it's very clear that the British people want to leave the European Union, and the government and the Parliament up to now has failed to deliver this, because there are some people who in Parliament who do not believe that this is good for the UK, that this will cause too much trouble, too many headaches, and they just want to ignore the will of the people. And the longer this drags on, I think the bigger the backlash is going to be whenever they finally go to the polls and have another election. So we'll have to see what happens. But I would say that right now, Boris Johnson, despite all of the controversy you hear in the news and everything, I think he has the wind in his sails right now.
One of the things that further complicates this potentially, and I want to have you explain this, Luke, is that, of course, in the parliamentary system, outside of his own district, nobody in the UK is voting yes or no on Boris Johnson. They're voting in their particular district or whatever term is used there. And if a majority of conservatives or a working majority of conservatives and some other coalition emerges from that election, Boris Johnson will remain prime minister. But from what I'm hearing, and like you said, with the class differential here, the clash of the classes perhaps is a good way to put it, is that it doesn't fall neatly along party lines. So there's some folks on the left who want to get out and some folks on the right who want to get out and some folks on the right who want to stay. So how do folks vote if this is the big issue?
Well, that's absolutely right. And there are a lot of working class, they call them constituencies, not districts. There are a lot of working class constituencies that have traditionally supported the Labour Party, being the party that has historically been seen, supportive of unions and the workers. And they want to get out. They overwhelmingly voted for Brexit. And they could very well switch to the Conservatives because it's going to come down to a very simple question. And Boris Johnson has already kind of made this his campaign slogan. And the question is, do you want Boris Johnson to go to Brussels and negotiate, or do you want Jeremy Corbyn, who's the leader of the Labour Party, to go to Brussels and negotiate? It's as simple as that. And Jeremy Corbyn is very unpopular across the UK. Most of his own party fear him becoming prime minister. I mean, he's a committed Marxist. He has a very cozy relationship with people in Cuba and Venezuela, and he's been, he's hosted Hezbollah and Hamas in Parliament before, and he's said very nice things about the IRA. He's a very dubious and questionable politician that almost ascended to his role as leader of the opposition by accident. And there are many that are concerned that he could actually become prime minister, and that's putting a lot of people off from voting for Labour because they actually don't want to see that happen. And in fact, there's poll after poll shows that people think the biggest threat to British politics is Jeremy Corbyn becoming prime minister, and that's even more of a threat than the UK just crashing out of the EU without some sort of an agreement.
And so for those who don't like the idea of a no-deal Brexit or don't particularly like Boris Johnson, just keeping the status quo and not allowing elections allows this to just spin its wheels in perpetuity? Is that their plan?
Well, I mean, we essentially have a zombie parliament right now in the UK. The prime minister doesn't command any sort of majority, but the opposition is so fragmented that they can't put up any meaningful united platform on any issue other than they don't want to leave the European Union without a deal. So until it's inevitable that there'll have to be elections because, there's more than just Brexit affecting the UK. They have economic issues, employment issues, trade, security, the domestic issues that every country has, and these have to be governed and dealt with. And you can't do this with a parliament that is a zombie parliament.
And lastly, what are the rules on the U.S. and the U.K. negotiating a new trade arrangement? We've heard a lot about this, but as long as they're still in the EU, are there rules against that, or are there ways to move the ball forward here so that folks who are worried about ending the UK's relationship with the European Union can see what type of relationship might replace that?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't actually describe it as replacing it. I think a lot of times people like to frame this as being either or, but the UK is the world's fifth largest economy, and it'll trade with the European Union and it'll trade with the United States. And in fact, even though it's a member of the EU, the UK already trades more outside of the EU than it does with the EU. And you're absolutely right to say that no formal agreement can be made between the U.S. and the U.K. until the U.K. formally leaves the European Union. I mean, this was one of the big issues during the whole Brexit debate. The fact that the world's fifth largest economy cannot even sign its own free trade deals. This is a bit of national sovereignty that it had handed over to Brussels. But certainly a lot of the legwork, the behind-the-scenes work, can be done now and is happening. I know for a fact. I speak to individuals who are involved in it, and there's strong support in the U.S. Senate for a trade deal. There's strong political support from President Trump, from Boris Johnson. So I think as soon as the U.K. leaves the European Union, we'll see this issue move very rapidly.
Luke, a lot of moving parts here, but right now everything seems to be in kind of suspended animation. We'll see when these elections actually happen and what happens then. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Luke Coffey is the director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.